joining you today. Was just saying earlier that this is the first time I've had a tech fail in 2 years, so I guess that's a pretty good track record. So I am going to be quick. My hope is to provide you with some context for this next session, where you're going to focus on the themes of truth, trust, and social cohesion, and trying to understand why it is that society has become so divided. So what I thought I would do, I have 10 minutes. I have 10 insights that I'm going to share with you based on the findings of the Edelman Trust Barometer. And for those of you who are unfamiliar with it, it's the largest global study of its kind. Edelman has been doing it for the last 22 years, and it looks at trust across institutions, those institutions being government, business, NGOs, and media. So first takeaway is that what we have seen over that time is a gradual decline in trust across all institutions. And in Canada specifically, that descent we've seen that over the last number of years. During the pandemic, though, we did see that there was a significant spike in trust, particularly in government. But 2+ years on, we've really we've returned to pre-pandemic levels of trust. So essentially amongst the general population, the trust in our institutions sits in a neutral category, with business being most trusted, followed by government and media at the bottom. And the one that has consistently been on top is NGOs. Second point, as a result of our decline in trust in those 4 institutions, what we've seen over the last number of years, both in Canada and globally, is that my employer is viewed as most trusted and the most credible when it comes to being able to decipher what information I'm consuming is trusted and truthful. And when you receive information from your employer, it's perceived to be as most believable. And it's more believable than information that you are receiving from government, traditional media even, as well as social media. Third takeaway, Canadians are really fearful of a number of issues that are facing Canada. Those include job loss, climate change, cybersecurity, also losing your freedom as a citizen, and experiencing racism and prejudice. 4, and I hate to be the bearer of bad news, but when we ask respondents a question around whether or not they believe that they and their family will be better off 5 years from now, only 34% of Canadians believe that will be the case. So there's a significant lack of economic optimism and unease about whether our current system is actually working. Another interesting point is that nearly half of Canadians say that capitalism as it exists today does more harm than good. 5th takeaway, when it comes to the media ecosystem, news sources are also really struggling with trust. Concerns about fake news are at an all-time high. And what is interesting is that in Canada, when it does come to sources for general news and information, traditional media is most trusted, whereas globally it's search engines. However, trust in traditional media has also continued to decline over the last number of years. And I don't think it will come as a surprise to any of you that social media is viewed as the least credible source for general news and information, with only 21% of Canadians trusting it. 6, the majority of Canadians worry that they're being misled by societal leaders. So when it comes to journalists and reporters, business leaders, and government leaders, 2/3 of Canadians believe that they are purposely trying to mislead us. That's a really, really disturbing finding. And less than half of Canadians view government leaders and CEOs as trustworthy. 7th point, this too is also an unsettling finding, that nearly 6 in 10 Canadians say that people are actually incapable of having constructive and civil debates about issues that they disagree on. So it really calls into question whether or not in Canada we're at a tipping point if we're so focused on our own points of view and not even being open to having conversations with our fellow citizens who may have a different perspective on a particular issue or topic. Number 8, CEOs, the expectations that we have of CEOs are much greater than they ever have been before. So when considering a job, and we all know that we're in the period of a great resignation, that employees have significant power, more power than they ever have before. And when considering a job, more than half of employed Canadians expect that their CEO is going to speak out on controversial topics and topics that they're passionate about. They also expect more than 75% of Canadians want CEOs to be personally visible when discussing public policy with external stakeholders, and also communicating how it is that their company is helping to contribute positively to society. And so there's this expectation now that CEOs, that one of their core functions is also a societal function, so that they play a significant role in helping to shape conversation on significant policy debates when it comes to topics like jobs in the economy, automation, wage inequality, as well as climate change. Now, importantly, and this is my 9th point, is that the expectation is that CEOs will inform on policy, but not engage in politics. So there's very defined guardrails when it does come to politics. And then my last point, just given the significant growing expectations that we have of CEOs today, there is a need for business and business leaders to step up when it comes to societal issues. So when we asked respondents about particular issues ranging from climate change to wage inequality to automation, by a very large gap, there is a strong feeling that business leaders need to do more, not less. So it really speaks to the role and the growing expectations that we have for business. They've never been more clear, and that business as an institution really needs to recognize the key societal role that they need to play. But lastly, and this is tied to the kind of work and the mission of civic action, is that the reality is that no single institution is going to be able to solve all of societal's ills. And therefore, there is a significant need for partnership between government, the public sector and the private sector, organizations like NGOs engaging with both government and business to tackle the key issues that we are facing as a society. So that concludes, my sharing of the key takeaways from this year's Edelman Trust Barometer, and hopefully sets the context and the stage for your discussion now.
Thank you so much, Lisa. we appreciate you setting that context, and I can tell just based on the subject matter and the topics that you've sort of brought up, we definitely have plans to sort of unpack that both in our panel and the activity that will take place post. So lots of synergy there. Thank you.
Perfect, my pleasure.
And we'll go as well as the Senior Account Director at Edelman, and will be your moderator for the morning. So Alicia, the floor is yours.
Thank you.
Screen sharing, Greg.
Beautiful. Well, good morning, everyone. Happy Saturday. And I think coming off from that a bit of a depressing / bleak data dump from Lisa was tough, but also really, really sets the stage for the conversation that we want to have this morning. As a bit of a recap, the panel today is called Truth, Trust, and Social Cohesion, Building Bridges in a Polarized World. And we have about 70 minutes to explore some really interesting questions that are hopefully going to unpack, why we're so divided in our approach to issues in the region, strategies that exist to move the needle forward. I'm going to take 2 minutes to quickly introduce our panelists, and then we're going to dive straight in so we can make the most of our questions this morning. Couple rules of engagement. If you do have a question, feel free to throw it into the chat. We'll have about 30 minutes at the end for questions, but if it's a direct response to something someone is saying, we can be fluid and add in questions throughout. So Zara, feel free to wave, Zara, so folks know who you are, but I don't think we can miss you this morning, is a public interest designer and strategist and an established bridge builder across grassroots and institutional spaces. She's currently the co-founder and CEO at Monumental, but prior to that, led Doblin Canada, which is Deloitte's human-centered design practice focused on engaging diverse sets of stakeholders to use design-led approaches. Among many accolades, Zara was recently named the University of Toronto School of Cities Urban in Residence. Welcome, Zara. Danny, feel free to wave as well, is passionate about education, healthcare, access to government services, social and economic inequalities. He currently serves as the Director of Policy in the Office of the Minister of Children, Families, and Social Development, and was previously a policy advisor in the Office of the Premier. Danny believes that to impact change, leaders must be able to connect, mobilize, and capture the imagination of people, empowering them to take action. Welcome, Danny. Riley, also feel free to wave. Riley is a queer Anishinaabe writer, researcher, and public speaker from Ebtimong First Nation. Her love and gratitude for her communities, passion for radical ideas, and the call she feels to challenge system is really what inspires her work, and why I think it'll be really interesting to hear from her today. Riley grew up in Thunder Bay, calls Toronto and St. John's, Newfoundland home, and has experience at all levels of change making. She is currently beginning her PhD at the University of Toronto. So welcome, panelists, and let's get straight into it. I have some open-ended questions, and then I have some direct questions to each of you. So we're going to start by unpacking a bit of a personal experience of mine. I recently got some interesting advice from a person I admire, and that advice was that whenever I'm having a conversation, if the person I'm speaking with says something that makes me feel angry, uncomfortable, or stressed, that I should explore that feeling and ask myself why I feel that way. To take pause and retrain my own thinking. Is it my own bias that's making me uncomfortable? Or is my lived experience telling me something different? Or do I simply not trust them because of who they are? Through this program and through our daily interactions with others and through our news feeds every day, we hear a lot about trust and polarization, both as it relates to dividing society, but also in its potential to bring us together. Our inclination as humans, especially in this virtual world, is to share heart emojis when we agree, but silence when we disagree. Each of you comes to this conversation with unique professional and lived experience. And so I'd like to start by asking, in your view, how has mistrust and polarization impacted the spaces and communities you operate in? And how do we learn to trust people with different and sometimes opposing viewpoints? So, Riley, let's start with you.
Yeah, thank you, Gretch. I'm so excited to be here. I haven't been part of the Diversity Fellow, initiative or meeting for many years now, and I'm always just astounded by like the brilliance that comes out of these spaces. So excited, first off. But to your question, it has affected, me personally, at least profoundly. I think back to what I consider one of my very first and largest experiences, like in a change making space, if you will, which was when I was like 17 years old. I applied to work for the Prime Minister, providing advice on the opinions of youth and everything that matters to youth in Canada. And I went in there being like, yes, we're going to make a change. Like, this is it. And I got there and was, so disappointed by the way it felt impossible to get anything actually meaningful done. The way that I felt so many people, especially, marginalized people's voices were pushed to the side, really not taken seriously in the space. And it like really for a long time, like I considered myself a bit of a recovering anarchist because I was like, change is impossible, I was in, the space with we're told, especially the most powerful people in our nation, and like nothing, it seemed, could be done. And so that's when I really realized, though, that there are multiple theories of change, and that we're often told that they exist in a hierarchy, and that some are more important to actually achieving goals than others, and how not true that is. And so in terms of how do I deal with polarization, I try and remind myself that dissent, discussion, time spent, where appropriate, in collaboration with other people is actually, not just not a bad thing. It's a best practice, right? It shows us about how many different perspectives are available, who is affected, what options we have to be able to accomplish things. But I also remind myself that collaboration is only useful so long as everybody in that space has the same core goals. And that needs to be understood, I think, from the onset. Otherwise, it can very much be a waste of time and space and energy. And sometimes people just need to be reminded, oh, we're actually here for this purpose. And, it's not necessarily, it's about making change in this way, not necessarily about, profit at this point, or what the public thinks, or whatever. How can we center our work on this point of change that we're all here and care about? And that gentle course correction can be all some people need. But then there's also the cases where they're like, no, my main priority is not that change, actually. It's about getting reelected, or it's about pleasing my shareholders. And in that case, there is going to have to be a different approach, I think, to being able to work in that space, understanding that oftentimes those people are still necessary to making certain things happen. And I can talk more about what those strategies I have found useful look like, but to say that, yes, I think that this is a very common thing that it takes you years to kind of develop a toolkit to be able to deal with.
And I love that, because I think even as a group, we have norms of collaboration that Greg shares on his screen, before every session. Zara, you have a lot of experience in design thinking, and I imagine trying to get people on the same page before, we come up with a solution. Curious your thoughts on the question posed earlier.
Yeah, I mean, Riley just laid out all these threads, so I might just pull on some of those. I mean, Riley's comment around proximity to power feels like a nice starting point, where I think I was just having a conversation yesterday with a mentee of mine, who I think used to be in this program, who was talking about the closer you get to powerful folks, the more you realize how they're surrounded and almost cocooned by their blind spots. And that, I mean, I count myself in that too. Like we're all in that soup of trying to figure out what are the limits of our knowledge and how do we identify those so that we can extend and open spaces to bring people in to help fill those gaps, to collaboratively work together. But to Riley's point, this person was sort of reflecting on, like, as you get closer to power, it's quite disenchanting because you start to see that the way in which change is happening here, and I'm creating a binary which doesn't actually exist, but I'm doing it for the sake of the example. The way that change happens in sort of institutional spaces and the way that change happens on the ground are completely different. And what I've experienced, and I had the same experience, you know, Riley, when you were talking about that example, the example that came up for me was I gave this talk last week, this keynote last week, that I'm not typically nervous, but I was extremely nervous. And when people were asking why, it was because it was a room full of folks who were incredibly powerful in the institutional spaces that I remember 20 years ago when I moved to Toronto had said, there's not a lot of room for the conversation you want to have in this city. It was around equity in cities and community. And then I would go out to communities and they're like, we're doing the work. Also, there's more hands, get in. Like there was two things going on. And I remember at the time starting to mistrust these institutional spaces because I'm like, this work is actually happening. And you're saying that it's not. But I'm on the ground and we don't have to name it. We don't have to call it the thing I called it, but it's happening on the ground. And now sort of as I evolved in my practice and as I was standing there, I realized that the piece that's actually like fosters the mistrust is in those spaces. I think what we need more from leaders is to start to understand who they are and the limits of their knowledge so that they can say, I don't think so. Not like so definitively, I don't know. And so a huge part of this, I think, and bridging the mistrust piece is having leaders who have a sense of who they are, their blind spots, their privilege, and their connection to social power, all those kinds of things, because it allows them to go into situations and say, say with more humility, I'm not sure if that would work, but let's keep the conversation open because I don't know what I don't know. And so I think that's the piece for me is that it's, when Greg said we had 3 minutes, I went off video to pull up a series I'm really, really enjoying called Middle Ground. I'll put it in the chat in a second. I don't know if anyone's watched it. Yeah, Riley, you've watched it? It's rad, right? It's like, I think it's produced by young people. I think it's produced by youth. And it's sort of these polarizing political issues in the US, and they facilitate these 10-minute conversations about like across the aisle. And really, it's about starting those conversations with talking about, here's my lived experience. And that's what's driving my perspective on this. And the last thing I'll say, because I'm sure Danny has a million things to say as well, is that is not the sort of paradigm of professionalism that we live in. The paradigm of professionalism that we live in is you step into spaces. Oh, someone, Anna Kay, you love Middle Ground. It's so great. You should watch it if you haven't. It's amazing. But the paradigm of professionalism that we live in is like, just polish yourself as much as possible, hide any part of your lived experience that doesn't connect you to social power, and step into spaces. And I think this conversation about stepping in with our lived experience is a very new muscle, I think, for a lot of us. Again, I count myself in everything. This is not a pointing fingers exercise. And I think that's the first step. Because when I think back to those moments where people say, oh, this won't work, it's not because they actually believe that. It's because they didn't take the time to reflect on the edges of their knowledge. And that is not seen as part of a professional practice or a leadership, not a professional practice, a leadership practice. Leaders are heroes, right? So supposed to be heroes.
Danny, I'd love to get your take on that. I think especially with your experience working municipal, provincial, federal politics and being in company probably quite frequently with folks who have a very different perspective from yours. Oh, and you're muted, Danny. Sorry about that.
Oh, all right. Hopefully that's the only time I do that today. It's a really big question because it permeates like all the work. I think probably we all do. And maybe I'll just maybe go one step further on sort of the pragmatic way I see this kind of coming out of institutions, right? Is all the things that have been mentioned are spot on, and so I won't even try to add to those directly, but I do think they come out of institutions in a specific way, which is which furthers the distrust, which is we just don't meet the urgency of some of the challenges we face, right? Due to the limits of knowledge, due to the need to be professional and very civil, and need to have answers. And then how that works is, institutions go out to the public and say, we've heard you on X issue and we provided Y solution, and everyone goes, A, that wasn't even the issue we're talking about, and B, that doesn't solve the issue that we're talking about or that you've just highlighted, right? And that breeds distrust too, when our institutions don't meet the urgency of the moment. And then when they kind of do, it's both surprising, and it makes all of the other persistent issues we haven't solved seem even maybe more frustrating and more persistent in hindsight. And I'm thinking particularly about things like CERB, which were imperfect, certainly, but people were like, "Oh, government can do that. That's interesting." But like, we can't figure out how to build an affordable apartment building. We can't figure out how to how to end chronic homelessness. We can't, all these problems that we've been talking about for 20, 50, 75 years, we can't figure out how to do. And no one really buys it, right? So that in some weird way, succeeding at the exercise of solving issues also breeds distrust, because you're solving selective issues, right? Or it's seen as that way. So it can be really difficult, because you actually need to prove sustained success and very consistent progress, or it's almost like you're cherry picking certain things and deciding to leave the other ones alone. So yeah, I know it's tough because I'm very close to it, right? I mean, I work at the center of institutions and distrust and really thorny issues. So it is just like I don't as much contend with it as I just kind of operate within it and try to influence it the best I can. I do think the point on professionalism and polish is really an important one, though. And I think all of my, little successes or lack of success have been based on the fact that I just don't do that. And there's a lot of people who don't, but it does create tension, right, in the workplace, or it can, where again, urgency should take precedent over, whether I'm wearing buttons on my shirt or not, or whatever, whether I have whatever degree I like. There's all this stuff that gets, and sometimes urgency can be uncivil. It can be messy. When you're highlighting the edges of knowledge, as Zara said, that can be tough to do in institutions that are both ill-equipped to receive that sort of criticism, but also, even if they receive it, there's not necessarily a way they can put that to use, or a way they can supplement the information they don't have. So I don't know if I've said much of anything, but I will end there.
No, I think that's great. And I'd love to maybe dig into your personal experiences a little bit. I'm a big believer that deeply contradictory views are important. Best solutions come from folks who may see the exact same challenge very differently. So I want to really unpack something we've already touched on a little bit, which is that difference between one's lived experience and their perspective, their point of view, their professional experience. Have you ever been in a room or been faced with a challenge where your lived or your professional experience wasn't valued? What was that like? Was it important to persuade the people around you? And how can we as fellows really start to articulate the difference between our lived experiences and our professional experiences? Danny, I'm going to actually start with you this time. We're going to keep the train going.
I was glad I didn't have to start the last question, but I realize now I got. That's a tough one. I mean, I think that happens pretty, like, I don't have an example. I think lived experience is dismissed almost outright in many circumstances, as either, you know, being too anecdotal or personal to matter in the macro, or or you somehow become biased, right? Which is also this hilarious thing where it's like you're trying to solve a thing that you've lived through, but you're too close to it, so you need someone who hasn't dealt with it at all because they're objective or something, and like none of it makes any sense. Certainly bias exists, but exists in many forms, and I don't think your lived experience skews your bias in any way that other things don't, like your lack of lived experience, for example. So I don't know. I think you know, I grew up kind of between Scarborough and Markham, bounced around a bit. Definitely like a low to low middle income house. I mean, there's just culturally, it's different than I would say many of the people I work with. I mean, I was the first person in my family here that half of it had immigrated to go to, you know, to school. Certainly, like my parents have no clue what I do for work. None of my family, like nobody you know what I mean? So it's that kind of thing. So there's those sorts of little nuances that are kind of funny, but in the workplace itself, even in really well-intentioned ones, it can be difficult. Like, so my mom's an ECE. She works, you know, in the not-for-profit childcare sector, for example. And I have two very young siblings who are now 12 and 16. And anyway, so I'm working on this childcare thing for like a year and a half, right? And I had to build up, whether it's right or wrong, it just of note that I had to work up like a ton of credibility. Because I'd go into these meetings with, you know, either 10 or 100 women, and they'd go, you know, who is this youngish white childless ass trying to tell us how to do child, or, you know, even at the table, right? So there's just funny stuff like that, which is totally fine and like probably necessary, but you do contend with a little bit. But it is all those other things I talked about which help, right? It's the urgency, it's the empathy, you know, all these qualities that actually help people kind of fill in the limits of their knowledge, because no one can replace your lived experience, but no one can also but in turn you have to open you know, the door to other lived experience to come in and sort of supplement yours. So I think as important as lived experience is, it's as you know, it's of equal importance or maybe more to have the qualities that, you know, of empathy, of compassion, of you know, emotional intelligence, of all these things, because your lived experience is that, and it's narrow, no matter who you are, right? So I don't know. It takes a lot. It takes a lot more than that, but certainly not dismissing lived experience is an important step.
Riley, over to you.
Yeah, I'm glad I had the time, because I was like racking through my brain. I was like, would this story be best, or would this story be best? So hopefully I landed on a good one. This one to me, I chose because I think it talks a lot about those different like life experiences, or like what I talked about either back when it's like maybe you just have fundamentally different core values, but also that like there is a way to approach those instances with like an element of strategy that you can feel like you got something a little bit fruitful out of. So the story goes that I was in Toronto actually in a meeting with the Prime Minister. And to this point, I had been so frustrated every single meeting, because I came out and I'd say something like, hey, I don't think your government should buy the Trans Mountain Pipeline. And I didn't necessarily expect that right then and there, you know, he'd be like, you're right, $17 billion, just not doing it. But like, you know, some level of engagement would have been nice. But instead, like, it was often like, I'd say something like that, and then there'd be a 15-20-minute speech about why they were going to do it anyways. And I was like, you know, I read the news, like I looked at your government statement, I understand your logic. I'm just saying I don't agree with it. And that seemed to be like, you know, not acceptable or not clear, or he didn't know how to handle that. And so understanding this, like in the space between our next meetings, I decided I was going to develop some sort of strategy that made it clear, like, you know, you don't have to implement this right here and now, but what I'm telling you is just my opinion, and you can take it or leave it, but I'm not looking for a rebuttal, basically. And so I figured I had to figure out a way to say this. And so I said, you know, hello, Mr. Prime Minister, my advice to you this meeting is that I think you need to support the non-member bill that's in the House right now about a national suicide prevention plan. And I came prepared and I said, Canada is the only G20 country that doesn't have a national suicide prevention plan. This is a specifically like racialized issue. Indigenous people are like 11 times more likely to commit suicide than any other demographic. And, went on, I was like, Quebec has one provincially, and like, we're going and going and going. And I ended it with saying, I'm not really looking for, your justification about why you haven't done it to date. I just wanted to put it on the table that this is something that I really care about and that I really think you should consider. And he stopped, and like, it was the weirdest interaction we had ever had to date. And he started and said, to really go off. And whether it was because, he fundamentally disagreed with me on that, or he just didn't realize that, in this space, he is the prime minister and I'm a 17-year-old girl. Like, that was not apparent. And he was like, you know what, Riley, plans don't save people's lives. Water saves people's lives. I guess talking about, boil water advisories on First Nations communities and stuff. And basically, I think the logic was like, I'm focusing on these things first, which is why I can't do these things. I think was communicated rather poorly. But once again, like, I could tell. And also he was like raising his voice, and I was like, and I had to take a breath and be like, okay, this conversation is going nowhere. And so I said, I really thank you for taking the time to listen to me. If you want to talk about this more, I'm more than willing to do that. Thank you so much. And like got up, took a beat and left and came back. And a couple minutes later, and in that time, he took the second to stop and go, you know what, like, I really apologize. I'm really passionate about this issue. And I think I really like got riled up and took that out on you. And I apologize. And so, the government hasn't created a national suicide prevention plan, no. But like, that was the first time that I had ever had a conversation with him. This actor in my life, who was consistently a very difficult one to engage with, where I felt like at least he heard me, and that was very clear. And so, but it took like many, many meetings and many frustrating encounters to realize who this person is, what their goals are, and, how can I best communicate? And so that was one time certainly where I felt like I again, didn't realize he was like talking to me about water. I'm like, I grew up in a community without clean water. I know, like, I know the social determinants of health, but like, it's a matter, it was totally a matter of like boundaries and bargaining. And that like is often the two B's I think about when dealing with actors like that.
I love that. I'm going to write that down. Boundaries and bargaining. Really, really cool takeaway. Zara.
Felt like when you asked the question, I just wanted to like take a deep breath and go off camera and like count to 5. Boundaries and bargaining is excellent. I can't count, not unlike Riley and Danny in different ways, like I can't count how many times my lived experience and even my professional experience have been discounted in a room. I have always been someone who sort of walked a distinctly alternative path, creating a portfolio of skills that I think will sort of enable me to do change-making work. And because of that, it doesn't follow a neat line that I think people understand. So I have to paint the story. I have to weave it. I have to do a lot of weaving for people, which I don't mind. But I think, the most formative experience, the genesis for me of the idea that lived experience is a strong and important credential was years ago. Because my sort of background was entering into the architecture community where, 15, 20 years ago, you talk to folks about how they got to know the places and specifically like, I'm talking about like public infrastructure or community-based infrastructure. And you talk to architects who were building in communities, they were building, schools, community centers, those kinds of things. And you'd ask them about, how they got to know those communities. And they would talk about surveys. They would talk about, census data. And, my eyes would roll to the back of my head and I felt like I was screaming to the wind. I was like, no, how do you get to know people? How do you get to know to Danny's point earlier, the issues that are urgent versus the issues that quantitative data will tell. Like I didn't have the language at the time to talk about, storytelling as meaningful material data, but I was trying to say that. And it just felt the wind was blowing in my face and I was screaming into it. So it was just, folks could not understand what I was trying to say. Why would you spend time with people when we have all of this data about what they need? And then consistently infrastructure was being built, to Riley's point, that was not getting to systemic needs. And so I was working, the context is I started working in Toronto post Summer of the Gun. So I was working in all of those communities, and there was public art programs, and there was this, and communities were like, we need space to grieve together. We don't, like, the public art programs are great, but we need space. Like, we need space to heal. We need space where we can come out of our apartments and be together, because we're really scared, right, to leave. And so anyways, all to say that that was my consistent formative experience of the first 5 years in my career. And I think, somewhere along the way, and I don't know, the season changed and the winds died down and I was screaming and people could hear, that, this idea that, because I sort of went off and I was like, okay, well, I'm going to start architecture projects without an architecture credential. I'm going to start projects in communities that build public infrastructure. And we're going to have experts on tap, not on top, right? We're going to have all the experts around to make sure that we're not, building buildings that fall down, but they're all going to be around, but they are going to be there to support us, not lead us. And so we were just building an evidence base, like tiny projects. Like, these aren't significant, like, they were small in scale, but they were transit planning projects, environmental stewardship projects, physical spaces, like, public infrastructure in these neighborhoods across the region that had just experienced a outrageous amount of gun violence and trauma and tragedy in their neighborhoods and communities. And we were just doing the work. We were finding pockets of money. There was no big dollars. We were piecing together $30,000 and $120,000 grants and building things and doing things. And starting to build, make the future the past for these industries that were like, well, if you don't have an architecture, public policy planning credential, you can't do this work. And so, and acknowledging there's a lot of privilege in even just being able to hack things together and make something work. But we were sort of building this parallel universe. And then when all of a sudden there was some urgency, and really it was, and I think for a lot of us, it was like heart opening 2020, because finally the world was listening, but it was also heartbreaking. Because all of a sudden everyone was like, oh, lived experience is a credential. And all of this, I think a lot of folks, and I've done a lot of work in mutual aid, all these mutual aid organizers were like, you think? Been doing really important work to address the gaps on the ground. We're finally being seen, like finally being recognized as actual, like, really smart policymakers, service providers, program designers, like really great strategists. They were finally being looked at as the people on the ground with the most wisdom to get us through crisis. So I think it was just, I've had these experiences where clearly I'm still exasperated. It's like, where it's like, oh my God, the world has opened up. There's so much work to do. And also we're all just so exhausted from having just done the work, because the institutions have not recognized people on the ground without typical credentials. So I don't know if I have a good answer. I feel like it's very much a work in progress. It's still, I'm still resolving the feeling of institutions now being super excited about, having, unusual suspects at the table and all of that, like, rhetoric. I can't embrace it yet, because I really just want, I'm such a huge fan. I always talk about Antoinette Carroll from the Creative Reaction Lab in Chicago. And she always says, you can't design anything. Like, you can't design anything material and meaningful unless you do three things. One, you acknowledge the situation that you're in. Second is acknowledge the history that got you to that situation. And the third is acknowledge the power constructs in the current approach to making that change. And I really do think that that's the piece. If we can start to move to a place where we do those things quickly, we don't have to, it doesn't have to be an extended process, but at the very least take a beat and acknowledge those things. Then I actually think we're moving into a new world order where there is where properly honor lived experience and professional experience, institutional experience as peers in change. I just don't think we can get there without acknowledging, you know, and I've thought about this a lot during the pandemic, is just watching mutual aid organizers like, and Danny, you worked at the municipality, you know, and you were there at the start of the pandemic. And I remember how many folks who were organizers calling me being like, the city wants to talk to me. SDFA wants to talk to me. It's like, they were so excited that the municipality was like, they want my support. They want my help. Well, how do I navigate this? I'm like, you just talk to them. You say the thing you're going to say, like you would say with any of us, you just step into it. So, you know, I think it's, yeah, I think that the last sort of threshold, sorry, and just one really quick thing I'll just add at the end is, I remember in these spaces, and then specifically when I started to get into more political and policy spaces, I would suggest things that I was hearing in community processes or outcomes. And folks would go, you know what, it's so complex, like the political landscape and da, da, da. And then I was running a corporate practice that worked in government. And I worked at ESDC for 2 years. And I was working with these incredible leaders who were like, yeah, it's complex, but here's how we get around it. You sit in a room, you rewrite a data protocol, and all of a sudden you can go talk to 15 people instead of 1,000. Done. So it was interesting to hear, it's so complex, you don't understand, you know, it's a great idea, like Riley, it's a great idea to have these plans, but like there's work to be done. And then to get in the room and you get the right people in the room within government, in those spaces specifically. And they were like, yes, and maybe if we rewrote these like little things that are orthodoxies, you know, they're not rules, they're just habits that we have in government. Let's try and change those habits. And I have tons of stories about how we made change happen, right? So yeah, I think we're still in the middle of, yeah, Riley, I love saying, is it complex or is it inconvenient? Yeah, and my experience has been, and now as someone who has more proximity or access to these institutional and, you know, these spaces of power, that there's a lot of orthodoxies that people just don't want to flip because it's inconvenient. And it means they might not be good at what they do for a little while they learn how to do, you know, behave in the new world order. So I'm going to stop.
I love that. Also really love, is it complex or inconvenient? My next question, I think maybe Danny, you can help us unpack some of this. Like I work in communications. And so a big part of my job was, when I worked in the not-for-profit world, politics, I'm now in corporate Canada, was about paying attention to the news. You know, what's going on in the world? How are we going to be impacted by it? Over the past decade, and in particular the past couple of years, there are deep, deep divides in the way we look at social issues. This will come as no surprise to you, Danny, but I read a Toronto Star article recently that said, quote, "It took the pandemic to get us to $10 a day childcare." Knowing that you played a fundamental role on this program, at a surface level, it seems really simple to gain consensus. It's an issue that I think everyone in this group cares about and understands is important. But I bet if it was actually that easy, we wouldn't have taken a pandemic to get it to happen, if that is in case true. In the various jobs you've held across municipal, provincial, federal government, why is it important to have opposing viewpoints when you're building policies for families? Does it in fact make the decision-making process easier or better? And follow up, a lot of questions within one question. Should we invite opposing viewpoints in our own communities to move the dial forward?
How long do I have for this? Oh man.
5 minutes, maybe less. Do what you can.
Okay, so I'll try to work through all that. So it did take a pandemic. That's absolutely, at its core, that's true. I worked on childcare in 2018 in Ontario, and the consensus was, maybe not the consensus, but enough of the prevailing view was don't tell us about free childcare. Nothing's free. Who's paying for it? If people want to have kids, it's their responsibility. I paid for my kid's child. It's same stuff you hear on all kinds of things, right? On OSAP reform and other stuff we did that, if I had it shitty, the future person must also have it shitty, or it's a mass injustice, which is like the most baffling problem we face on social progress probably in the country today. But so in 2018, it was those things, right? Or maybe I don't have kids, I don't pay for other people's childcare. It wasn't seen as this social and economic good. And there are many reasons for that. Predominantly affects women, mothers. The workforce in early childhood education is 97% women. Also, there's lots of reasons why this issue has been dismissed as sort of a women's or children's issue, which it is absolutely not. Fast forward to the pandemic, people can't go to work, productivity suffers, all the stuff that unfortunately gets people's attention. By people, I mean institutions and white men who run banks. Then it's all of a sudden really important. Not to say they have an agreeable view or a consensus view on how to solve it, but at least it's been elevated to, yeah, we probably have to do something about this, because now we understand that, getting more parents, typically mom, back to work is critical. It provides, it's great for the kids, good for the economy. It's this whole thing. So very quickly that became a consensus view that it was all of these things at once, even though a ton of people knew that 50 years ago, legitimately 50 years ago, when there was a commission on this stuff. So, to Zara's previous point of just like almost not being able to accept this, like people are just like, what do you mean it's an economic good? Yeah, we said that in 1977, like where have you idiots been? It's brilliantly simple on the comms side, right? $10 a day childcare, beautiful, right? As a comms person, thank you to your field for that. So that's great. But every province and territory has a different system. It's really provincial jurisdiction. So the federal government is we're entering a new frontier, and we try to tackle this. There's different politics in every province and territory. There's a constitution at which we can't overreach. So the issue with this complex or inconvenient thing, which is spot on, is that institutions use complex so often doesn't mean anything anymore. So when things are actually complex, like jurisdiction or building a childcare system, people just go like, yeah, sure, like whatever, because we say everything's complex when it's not. It could be inconvenient. It could be a lot of things. It's that some things are not complex. So, we negotiated bilateral agreements with every province, starting from a different place, ending in different places, getting to $10 a day. And I don't want to bore anyone with those details, but really difficult and genuinely complex work. But there was enough of a consensus on the ground and enough an affordability focus, right? Not just a system building focus, not just building, spaces or on quality or on other things that are really important, but we led with the affordability message. And then it was a bit of a Trojan horse, right? We said $10 a day childcare, and then we got to, enhance quality, enhance, regulatory systems, build more spaces, train more folks, increase wages, do all these things, right? So on the part of your question that was about opposing viewpoints, do you invite? I mean, it depends on intent. Some people have opposing viewpoints just to be shitheads and have opposing viewpoints, right? Like, and I think intent and desired outcome are really important, right? So yes, you absolutely need to invite all sorts of viewpoints into the conversation. But like, I don't know how useful, like, I don't have kids, so I hate this. Like, is that a useful viewpoint? Or, ECEs, find a different field if you're making minimum wage, like, not my problem. Like, there's some viewpoints that are just not, they exist, certainly, but I don't really have an answer whether you need to bring them in. Like, my view would be, it's a real challenge to me, the urgency of issues, if you're bringing in all sorts of viewpoints that actually want to like totally destabilize the work you're doing, and just don't share like a worldview, right? You know, there are real and existing sentiments on childcare still that are really pertinent, right? And it's like it's in this constant battle of consensus view and where it's gonna go, right? This is a 5-year project. Like I'm hoping I think it will, because again, that affordability piece is really hard to take away. But there are so many sneaky little political things that make it really difficult, right? You know, it became, we're seeing recently, you know, freedom versus government control, right? So through some lens, publicly funded childcare is government control and anti-freedom, which to me is absolutely bananas, but it holds water for a lot of people, right? So how do you bring in those views and bringing in views also means you have the opportunity to engage with those views and hopefully evolve some of them and maybe evolve your own too, right? So I don't know if I'm answering this really, really difficult question, but I think you have the right to be dismissive of views if they are inherently dangerous or you know, really put folks in danger. If their main goal is to exist to destabilize you and there's no actual thing, you know what I mean? If they just want to burn the thing down, I don't know if you need to make that time. So yeah, I don't know. I don't know. It's such a big question. I think I missed like 3 questions in your question also. So let me know if I've totally gone off the rails here.
I know. I think that was great. And I mean, it really speaks to being, I think, selective on, you know, who we invite to the table, really establishing those like norms of collaboration, like dissent for the sake of dissent versus like, what is our ultimate goal and are we trying to get there? I think a really interesting thing about the childcare, you know, I'm not going to say debate, but about childcare in general is this idea of what it means to be Canadian. And particularly, you know, the norms that we've adopted as Canadians. Riley, this last question's to you, and then we're going to open it up for fellows. As I'm sure you no doubt know and have experience with, you know, living in Canada, being Canadian, very, very complex identity, especially as it relates to, you know, all of the different lived experiences we all bring to the table. I would say, you know, despite our differences, one of the things that we all as fellows bring to the table is our desire to make positive change in our own communities. So I'm curious, you know, what role does our individual identity play in the contradictory views of this country? And how can we use our identities to really just find common ground with each other and then solve problems that we're passionate about, which is really ultimately what we're here to do?
Ooh, I like it. This is basically the whole premise of this like idea I tried to tackle that I would change a million things about now with a TED Talk I did in like 2018, which was like, is it time to rethink Canada's nice identity? And to spoil it, yes, is the answer I have. And the whole logic I came about this was it was during the Canada 150 year, and the Globe and Mail posted 2 pieces each day about like, what do Canadians abroad, like how does Canada see it throughout the world? And they were like, oh my God, they're so lovely, Canada's the best. And then they looked at like the perspectives from Indigenous people the next day, and they're like, you know, like this place is violent, it is, you know, really hard to live here. It's like all of these things. And so like, this has been like Canada, I often say, has, I think, like some of the best PR of like any country really ever. They like have, and I think a lot of people are willing to just like an average Canadian is, I think, willing to like accept that identity that Canada tells us we have. And that I think it's really important that we do sort of reassert our identities in different ways. And for me, that will always come back to like aligning ourselves with the marginalized. To also jump to the latter half of that TED Talk, where I give an example of a Pakistani woman who like came up to me and she's like, the things you're describing about the Indigenous experience in Canada is so resonant to me of my experience. And she's like, and I thought Canada was the greatest ever, but I see you, I hear you, and I'm sorry I didn't know, and how can I help you now? And I contrast this with the way other people came up to me and they were like, these are basically lies they were saying, or, but have you ever considered that it could be worse to live in the US? Like, these sort of narratives that people alternately gave me. And just to say that I always strive, and I think we should all strive to be that third woman, right? Who, like, all of these narratives that especially come from powerful bodies like the Canadian settler colonial state, for example, those hold way less water to me than certainly Canada wants it to, and certainly we're taught to hold it as, and it will always come back to other kin and to other people and the most marginalized person in the room. And I also, like, the conversations, I just like to end it off to want to say that the most meaningful ones I've had actually, and the solidarities that I've had between Indigenous people and immigrants to Canada on this conversation about Canadian identity. And there are so many folks that who I've talked to, and they say their experience in being an immigrant or a first generation Canadian or second generation Canadian is that, we are told to be so grateful to live in this state, right? And I'm like, you never have to be grateful to an imperial body. You have no need to be grateful to, somebody who commits genocide against Indigenous people, sells arms across the world, like does all of these things that destabilize other regions, a huge contributor of climate change. You do not have to be grateful to them. You do have to be, I think, and instead, you should be, I think it'll be far more fruitful to be in relationship with the people who are actually making, if anything on this place is great, it's because of those communities of people who have stood against the state, actually, in most cases, again and again and again. And that's where you'll find like change in spite of all those things happening. And like I think like for me, that has been so transformative. I know for so many people I talk to, and it's like a completely reshaping of what it means, I think, to live on these lands, to be in solidarity with others, and to be a good relative generally. And so, yeah, I hope that sort of captures the picture of it.
It really does. Thank you. That was amazing. Fellows, the floor is open. Feel free to unmute yourself, ask a question, shoot me a private message. I can ask it anonymously. Or you can throw your question into the chat.
I could start. It's not actually a question. Am I echoing for anybody?
A little bit, but we can hear you fine, Sukriti. So yeah, okay. Go for it.
Okay, great. Wow, I can hear myself talk, sorry. All right, I'm gonna try. It's not a question, it's just a comment for Riley on the anecdote you just shared about speaking to the Pakistani woman and connecting with immigrants about this. I'm glad you shared this because I think as a first generation immigrant, I only found the language to describe the experiences I went through when I finally sat in an Indigenous policy class. And I had a professor who was an Indigenous elder, and once she started describing like one incident after another, the genocides and with everything, suddenly I was like, whoa, I think I know this experience. I think I've been through something parallel to it. But nowhere in my institutions and in the universities I'd been in for years had there ever been acknowledgement of the ways that I navigated those universities totally differently than really any of my peers from other demographics did. And it gave me just a totally different level of empathy for Indigenous communities. So I'm happy to hear that that's reflected in more than one experience.
Thank you for sharing that, Sukriti. Jamil.
I just wanted to quickly ask you all, first of all, this is an amazing group of panelists, and I'm so happy that I could participate. I wanted to ask you about the social media piece of it all. And we heard at the beginning that people, they know social media is not credible. Like, I think the statistic was like, oh, only 19% of people think social media is credible. But I can't help but be cynical about that, because I think, you know, we think generally social media isn't credible, but when we're listening to the people we follow, we do think they are credible. And it is this echo chamber. And it strikes me that, like, maybe part of this polarization is because the pace of discourse has changed so much. Like, maybe over many decades, you know, social change and discourse changed very slowly. And there was time for people to hear it on their own in their circles and interrogate it for themselves. And like, it was this much more organic, I think, social process. And now the discourse changes like literally by the day. And when you're in social media for 1 week, you've consumed like 10 steps in the process. So, you know, you have two people who have gone so deep in the opposite direction, and there's so much in between that hadn't been unpacked. And I think it also makes people quite intolerant. Like, you know, it's like, I'm deep in it. How are you not deep in it? How did you not see it? How do you not understand it? And I'm like, I don't see this changing, right? Because it's sort of the new normal. And I'm just wondering, do you have any thoughts on like, how do we compensate or remedy for this new reality? How do we ensure people can, you know, at least meet somewhere? Like, the pace can be feasible for people to understand each other a little bit better. I mean, I don't know. I think it's a big question, but I'd be curious to hear your thoughts.
Who wants to go first? Zara?
Sure. There's so much to say on this. It's such a good question. I think we're all still figuring it out too. So Jamil, I'm going to do my best to give the hot take of the day, but it could change tomorrow. You know, I had this experience. My colleague Kofi Hope and I find ourselves in spaces a lot where we are holding space. We're holding the tension, like we're the tension holders, where there's like grassroots communities and institutions. And we're trying to sort of help everyone get into right relations with each other. And we've done a lot of this over Zoom the last 2 years, of course. It's been extremely hard. And then now there's this hybrid reality where we're kind of in person, and those conversations are a lot easier, right? Those conversations, they're not easy, they're easier. And, you know, Kofi and I just keep having these conversations about, or these dialogues about how, where possible, we need to find balancing moments where the only, like, you know, digital is not the only way that we're connecting. And I know that's not always possible, but holy smokes, like, we've witnessed extreme conflict and held space for that. And it's been sort of, you know, intense for us too, in the online space, and then just being offline, it's so transformatively different. So that for me is a signal in the noise, right? There's a signal in noise around, like, you know, the veil of humanity is like pulled back when you're on Twitter, and it's like, these people aren't humans, they're entities versus like people who have complex identities and experiences. The thing I will say is that, you know, some of my students, I teach at the University of Toronto Scarborough, and a lot of my students say that urbanist Twitter makes them feel bad about themselves. So there's all these fights about the state of cities. And these are students, you know, especially at the University of Toronto Scarborough. Are there any UTSC folks here? No? Okay, well, UTSC is a really cool campus of U of T because, you know, you've got a very different demographic than downtown. And so students are like on loans, hustling to be in school, like they are there 5 minutes before class and 20 minutes after class is over, soaking in every second of that experience. And when they go on to urbanist Twitter, a lot of them just sort of share that the conversations are happening at the level of policy, at the level of, the most recent news article that you've had to have read to understand the context. They don't even feel like they can participate. And they feel so far away from that conversation that they don't even know how they're going to be a meaningful actor in the city space, in the city building space, whatever you want to call it. So, I don't know what the remedy is. But I know that, for me, it seems very, not simple, but it's like just the balancing energy of having meaningful conversations that they're a part of in real life have been extremely transformative, to just give that antidote that Twitter is not the world and that actually communities don't have their most meaningful dialogues on Twitter. I know that for a fact, that a lot of communities don't have their most meaningful and intimate dialogues on Twitter, but you have to help folks believe that, that otherwise you can just feel like you're at a distance from the critical conversation that's happening. So it's not a remedy. Sorry, Jamil. I'm sure Riley or Danny have a clearer course of action, but I'm with you. I'll just say I'm with you, and we have to, find a way to be more human in these spaces.
Oh, maybe I'll just really quick. I love that last point, because that was exactly what I was going to say about like injecting humanity back into what is like so so inhuman about social media and like discourse that happens there. I think a lot of these platforms, as much as they tout it to be, like, they are not conducive to meaningful like debate, conversation, collaboration, even though, like, Mark Zuckerberg will try and tell you they are. But I was going to say also, like, just really quick to like push my policy agenda, is that also to go more to the root of the issue, is that Canada has really terrible, very weak anti-radicalization policies. And the ones that do exist, like, really don't touch on social media. I think they're trying to reform them right now in like, and especially in different provincial levels, but like the anti-radicalization stuff that we have is like specifically the like post 9/11, specifically targeting brown people from like terrorism, that is the whole arc. But there's nothing for like alt-right radicalization. I think they just maybe introduced something the other year, maybe just to start like doing it, but it's like really delayed compared to a lot of other countries. It's like really not as tangible. And I think like we don't even realize how much of that stuff like is just passing on our feed every day too. And we're also indirectly consuming that can like make it very, very hard in like a psychological way to like, even to get to a place of like, oh my gosh, we are like on totally different worlds now, right? Like once you're starting to seep into like radicalized spaces. But so anyways, just that I think like there's like also action that government can take, and that lots of people are advocating for stronger policy to help bridge those issues.
Amazing. We've got about 10 minutes left, and I see we have 2 hands up. So I think that's probably enough time for just the 2 more questions. Lauren, over to you.
Hey everyone, just want to first of all thank you all for your time and your insights. It's been really wonderful to listen to. I will also just preface this question by saying that in the interest of my mental health, I've taken a lot of time away from the news. So forgive me if I if I have missed some things. But Danny, I found it really interesting when you were talking about the this awakening that folks have had around actually requiring affordable childcare. And the work that you're doing in that space. And I'm interested to understand if there's been any connection or talks with the private sector, particularly these corporations who have not realized that women or families require childcare, if they are coming to the table with, solutions or funds or what that looks like as well. Because I do recognize, the government plays an important role in providing a safety net in this country for people. I'll take that with a grain of salt because of course there's, things with that, but in theory, they are supposed to provide that. But I'm just wondering if there's been any kind of onus put on corporations or private sector to also help with figuring that out in your experience.
Cool. Hey, and I'm glad you've been taking care of yourself. That's important. And there's not much you're not missing much in the news. Um, so I mean, the sort of facetious answer to that question is we didn't put any onus on the private sector to do this because we wanted it to get done. And that's just to say, I think there's a belief in the problem, but in terms of what like the antidote is, or what the, to have a solution that matches the diagnoses, like there's just there, it wasn't there. So I think there's a broad interest. But if corporate Canada wanted to, and I say like there's a, that's a million to different things, but if corporate Canada, let's call it that for now, wanted to provide accessible, universal, free, or affordable childcare, I mean, they could have done so at any point. They have the real estate, they have the means. Like it's the same thing on any social issue, right? If they actually wanted to do the thing, they could have done the thing. If the provinces wanted to do the thing, they could have done the thing, right? This is the provincial jurisdiction. Provinces, other than two, put $0 new dollars into this, right? So, yeah, I think the private sector actually has a massive role to play, not in a corporate Canada sense, but part of the complexity of building the system is you have a whole bunch of for-profit private providers, and that's where the politics comes in, right? Because I think objectively, most people will probably agree that it should just be treated like public school, right? You have access to a thing because you are a person who lives here, and you have a young person or people in your house, and you can go access the service. Which is high quality and safe, and in broad terms. That would mean putting sometimes thousands of people out of work. So politically, that's untenable. So what do you do there? So what we tried to do was basically grandfather in home-based and small for-profit providers, put more controls on profits so that we're not funneling money to shareholders in any way, and basically make it untenable with provincial partnership for big box expansion, right? Which in again, an objective way is good because you want to build this high quality public service. In a somewhat kind of populist way, it's good because, even Alberta, they don't want to be seen as having public money support, line the pockets of shareholders, like all this very sort of populist kind of funny stuff. So that's great. You find common ground in strange places sometimes, right? So I think there's a huge role for the private sector, but in terms of actual corporate Canada, they played a role in conjuring up interest in the issue. Full credit, right? I mean, you don't usually have bank CEOs writing op-eds about childcare, so that's cool. Like take that 100%, and that's not a small thing, really. That is a high impact thing and an admirable thing, but it's also an easy thing. Right? You can write 400 words on the importance of something. I could do that. That's a great job. If I could do that, that'd be amazing. And then someone else would have to do the actual stuff, right? So it's helpful, but it's also like the easiest part of the thing, which is to, shine a light on the problem from your platform, which again, is not a given, but is a relatively easy and small thing. Provide no real solution other than say it needs to be more affordable and accessible, and then you leave the rest to government, which is correct. I mean, I'm glad it's been a government response, but I do think on so many of these things, from equity to climate change to income inequality to support for mutual aid groups to all kinds of different stuff. I mean, the corporate Canada has largely underperformed. I'm trying to be generous. I don't know how else they. Yeah, especially through the pandemic, right, where it's been glaring, the ways in which they could have got involved in support, and some have. But again, in broad strokes, they didn't take a huge role on, and we didn't ask them to because we were working under a really small amount of time and wanted to get a thing done. And it's just not. It's not a reliable or there's no precedent for corporate Canada doing this, I guess. So why would they do it this time? Shout out to all the private sector people on the call. I'm sorry. Corporate Canada does a lot of good things, I'm sure. Just childcare is not one of them. It's fine.
I'm gonna jump in really quickly and just poll the panel. Folks, do you have another 10 minutes to spare? And there's no pressure, no judgment. Be honest with me. If you don't, that's completely fine.
Yeah, I'm good, Greg.
Okay, Riley, you're good. Tara, you're good. Okay, now I pull the fellows. Fellows, we were meant to go to a 15-minute break. This will require us to sacrifice a bit of time as it relates to a break. We still plan on ending at around noon. Are we okay to have these two questions come up, and then we'll kind of maybe take a really tiny break and then jump right into our final portion of the morning? I see nodding heads and thumbs up. All right, perfect. Then Alicia, the floor is yours again.
And Greg, sorry, if we have 10 more minutes, can I hot pursuit Danny? Can I just hot pursuit Danny's comment?
Most definitely.
Really quick to say, and Danny, everything you just said makes me think about why the big ask of corporate Canada is to embed equity as strategy, not as CSR. When you think about it as CSR, this doesn't fit within your mandate. When you think about it as advancing what you're strategically trying to do. So an example, back when I used to advise and work with banks, they would say our number one, goal for our, banking services is onboarding new clients. We want to onboard 500,000 new clients this year. Well, could we think about what happens for folks who don't have access to the financial system, don't have an address to open a bank account so that they can get their OW and ODSP, here. And so could those 500,000 of that, could we say 50,000 are folks who don't have access to the financial system, and we'll design something super cool so that they can actually do it without having a tenured address? Wouldn't that be amazing? You get your new customers, good for you, your corporate agenda soars, and we start to address some real issues in it, bridge some inequities. And so when we talk about equity as strategy, that to me is the frontier for this work, is to say, pull those conversations out of the sort of chicken soup for the soul space and pull them into the strategy space. And that's where we'll start to see investments, not that's where we start to see solidarity, not charity, right?
Love the direction this conversation is going, especially as it relates to our next two questions, both fellows who work in corporate Canada. So Smriti, over to you.
Yeah, I was cracking up because the next two questions come from bankers, or at least people who work at banks. I will not throw none under the same bus as myself. However, I'm going to pivot. I actually love that the conversation kind of went to the place of CEOs and the role, especially with the Edelman information that we got with respect to trust. And I think the reason I'm going there is, Zara, you said something that I really loved, which is the traditional paradigm of leadership and professionalism is that you polish yourself all in a certain way and try to align to kind of social power and corporate norms. And one of those things is, going back to Danny's point about, a CEO, writing an op-ed or opining in the Globe and Mail. We all know they don't write those. And the likelihood of them ever expressing their true and honest opinions is unlikely because of all of the considerations they have to have, primarily shareholder reaction, employee reaction, et cetera. And recently, I guess, TD announced that they were going to raise salaries by 3% for certain levels and below. Naturally, every single bank had the exact same question that wasn't TD, are you doing it for us? And I was in the room where one of our very senior executives basically just verbal diarrheaed a bunch of stuff that was in the executive playbook. It was the right down the line answer, and it was the appropriate answer, but inevitably the wrong answer too. And so I'm really curious about, and I don't mean wrong because whether they do or don't raise salaries is a bank decision, but it's just how you respond. So I'm very curious with respect to changing and kind of unpolishing or leading and with your lived experience and kind of just being more direct and candid. How do the three of you kind of step into that and be yourselves in those spaces to still make impact, but B, what would be your ask to corporate, Canada, and how executives and CEOs can actually make change? What role would you want them to play? Because let's be honest, they're not necessarily suited to speak to equity. They're suited to getting some folks involved who can maybe actually make change. All right, thank you.
Who wants to tackle that first? It's a big one. Danny, I'm gonna put you on the spot.
Oh boy. I mean, like the easiest one is when you actually don't have to shift much strategically for them and something just aligns, right? So for example, using Zara's point, you know, if a bank wants to bring in new customers, let's say they want to bring in new customers in a particular part of the city. I don't know if banks think that way, but let's pretend they do. Then, okay, I'm from Scarborough. They need another 100,000 people from Scarborough. So then naturally you become an ally and they're like, oh, all of a sudden your lived experience is valuable and interesting. Please tell me more, right? So like there's those kinds of things that exist and are fine. I mean, beyond that though, I've only seen it happen when folks actually get into leadership positions, right? And then that's how things change at these institutions, right? For the most part. So either it's someone sort of navigating their way with enough charm into a position where they can actually change things, and then maybe leveraging their lived experience in a different way once they're in that position, or empowering others to do so, or both, right? That happens. But in terms of what corporate Canada can do, I mean, they can literally do anything, right? Like there's no parameters, there's no rules. They can like pick your issue. They can tackle it in whatever the way they want, right? I mean, it just costs money, right? Like think about stuff like climate change or stuff that's particularly unprofitable now, but will be really unprofitable in the future. Like they can do anything, and anything like they say otherwise is total crap, right? And it's not that dissimilar from government, but I would say there's even less restraint on corporate Canada. You know, and coming at it through the pandemic, or I don't know if we're ever going to be out of it through it, latter half of it, whatever. You know, you think about housing for workers, think about sick days, like just basic shit that, you know, corporate Canada can play a huge role in, and it is in their self-interest to do so. So I don't have a great answer for this other than like the jargon and the rhetoric is often totally, whether they mean it or not, it's totally misplaced. You know, again, on childcare example, like they have the asset, right? They have the real estate. It's not hard to hire staff and retrofit a few thousand square feet of space. So there's some really low hanging fruit that they could contribute to, that they, even now in childcare, right? Like you could still retrofit a space, put it not for profit in the first floor, and bam, like you could access federal dollars for, you don't have to pay for it. Will that happen? Probably not, but it could, right? So even where there's money available and literally no restraints, and they own the asset, they're not doing anything. So I don't know. I don't know how to push that needle any further. This is not my area of expertise, so I apologize.
I will just say that I think a lot of motivation to do this work is when people realize there's a cost to the problem. Oh, we don't have paid sick days, we're losing folks, we have to hire new folks and train them, and and that's costing us money, and that's the impetus for change. But I think at a really individual level, I'm just going to share my screen. I'm sorry to share my screen. I know that's annoying on a Saturday morning, but I'll do it for just a hot second, which is I have found that a lot of leaders that we've worked with in corporate Canada have really responded well to being forced to look at their identity a little bit. I don't know if folks know the power flower. I can send it around, but you know, it's an anti-oppression tool. But the only piece I'll just quickly point everyone's attention to is when individual leaders start to get a sense of, you know, so we do this exercise with folks, that inner ring, how I see myself. So you fill in the different slots. And then the outer ring is how the world sees me. So you have these conversations with like senior executives who are like, I grew up with nothing. And like, I'm a self-made man. And so it's like, so then under class, you know, under the class one, they grew up low income, right? I grew up low income and rural. But then when they get to how the world sees me, we're like, well, you wear a suit and you walk down Bay Street. So when the world sees you, the world does not see a rural, like low income self. They see like a white male from the establishment in a suit walking down Bay Street. And what I find is that a lot of them are like, whoa, like it's this like, you know, my work in the world is not to, you know, help establishment men have their awakenings, but now and then it's useful to just like move the dial forward a little bit. And so I think there's a deeply personal part of this where leaders actually need to understand that difference between how they perceive themselves and how the world perceives them. Because I think how they perceive themselves are like, well, I've grown up with nothing. I know how to design for that. And it's like, no. You still grew up white, like you still grew up, and so I still grew up sort of within the European, you present as, you could be white presenting in the world, and you could sort of assimilate into white Canadian society quite easily. So I do think it's a deeply personal thing for leaders. And I don't say like CEOs exclusively. I even think the folks that work around them that are making the decisions, to the earlier point, they're not writing these op-eds. People writing the op-eds are also often those folks. And so I think it's the spiral learning model. We start with self, we go to society. Right. And so I think a lot of this has to be individual learning journeys to get to the collective understanding of what to do, because you just can't do it if you think about it as an intellectual exercise exclusively.
Thank you, Zara. Nona, we're going to take 30 seconds to your question, and I would encourage maybe one person out of Zara, Danny, Riley to respond, and then we've got to wrap things up. Sorry to be time police. Nona, over to you.
I will try to be quick. Firstly, thank you for all of your comments and insights. And when the panel first started, I was a little bit, I'm not going to lie, like rolling my eyes, because we all come in with these rose tinted glasses, and the fellows do as well. And as I think about, building bridges and what's required, and we are expecting people to come in with a sense of empathy and understanding, and all of you kind of discussed the ingredients to coming to the table and how that builds bridges. But in your individual stories, my takeaways were that you all actually found workarounds, whether it's screaming into the wind until you finally got heard, or systemic or societal changes just kind of lining up just so. Or Danny, you mentioned, I operate and I find my way around. And so I guess we're all thinking that the people that we are in the room with, or these leaders, are coming with the same humbleness or intent as we are. But the truth is that they're just, most of them are still not there. They're not able to be self-aware enough to say, oh yeah, I have this gap, so I need to bring in Zara to the table. Like, let's be honest. So we're making some preconceived assumptions, I guess, that these things will be already there to make a catalyst to have these conversations. And my question is, if we take a step back, how do you even make those leaders or those people understand or become self-aware that they have those gaps? And I'll use a recent example. I work at a bank, and I was tasked with leading a philanthropic response for what was happening in Ukraine. Meanwhile, I was dealing with a personal issue that also hit close to home. And my leader at the top, who I was working with, did not understand the challenge and the conflict between the two while I was doing my job. And I used that as a teaching. I tried to use that as a teaching moment to say, hey, I want her to be self-aware enough that our lived experiences and our professional experiences can often come together. And I wrote her an email, not expecting a rebuttal. Riley, to your point, I wanted to be heard and for her to have that aha moment. And what I got in response is, my prayers and wishes are with your family, which was so insulting. So this is, I guess, at the crux of it, I'm thinking to myself, what is the point if these people are not yet there, and how do we get them there from our positions? I hope that made sense.
Riley, I'm going to actually put you on the spot to maybe respond to this one.
Okay, yeah. I mean, a big question. I'll try and go quick. I think I return back to, okay, one, this boundaries and bargaining. And I think that Zara touched on it also when it was okay, I see your goal. Your goal is, in your case, you want me to be your worker and show up and do things, but despite external conditions that make that actually practically impossible. This is not possible. This might be a very privileged thing to be able to say to your employer as well, I recognize, but the immediate thing that comes to my mind too is being if you want me to be able to do this work, this is the bargain we have to make. I have to be able to do this in order to do that. And so it sucks to have to make it transactional. It should be this place of true empathy and understanding that guides that. But I also recognize that that's not how a lot of people work when, their core just doesn't go there, and that it's going to take a lot of time and energy probably to educate to do that. And in the immediacy, that might not be possible. But I think also in an instance where perhaps like maybe they're just, they just oversaw this, like they're misguided, maybe they want to do the right thing, but just are missing it in this case. There's different approaches you can take there. And I think that often that comes from like posing questions. I often like to do as like an education tool. So like, again, somebody will say something like, yeah, we need, another example that was said, like, we need 100,000 people from Scarborough to come and do this. The question you should be asking is, what is keeping that many people from doing this, right? And like that flip, like, I think a lot of people, especially in the corporate world, I have found like, I've only ever been in these spaces really as like maybe a consultant or like coming in to do a D&I speech, but like, is that I think that there's a real there's often a very real lack of creativity in that way. Like, it's like, I'm here because I know how to do my work well, but to think about being able to do this in like, a completely different, creative, boundless way, not often I've found a bountiful skill set. And so like, I think sometimes it is like really exciting when people feel like they're learning something totally new and a totally new way of approaching the thing. And that can sometimes light off an aha moment. But again, I think only if they truly want to have it. And if not, like, that's where I think like the B&B I'll go back to, and hopefully, even though it's not nice and it's not how I would love to make change happen and meet goals, I think is sometimes like very pragmatically effective.
Love that. What a great way to, I think, wrap up that question. Ask more questions, put people on the spot. Okay, we are over time. Riley, Danny, Zara, thank you so much for the past, like hour and a half, I want to say. This was amazing. I hope everyone else enjoyed it as well. And Greg, Maddie, Emma, back to you.